All right, so tonight we're going to go to 1 Timothy. We're going to start in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Let's just go ahead and jump there right away. And in first Timothy chapter 3 says, this statement is trustworthy. And that's important because if you're going to move forward with the verse, you want to know that what it says is correct. So it says, this statement is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to be an overseer, he desires a good work. And that's important because it sets a standard for us. If anyone aspires to be an overseer, there are things that we are specifically called to, ministries that we're specifically called to, and then there are ministries that we step into. We use our abilities, we stretch ourselves, and we step into a ministry that we're equipped for. So, for example, a person may be, from a ministry perspective, equipped to be an overseer. Let's say they're a manager in a business, or they're a CEO of a business, or they're an entrepreneur and they run their own business and they manage other people. And if you're in the position, maybe even a school teacher that's managing people, keeping order with people, educating people, that kind of thing. So if that's within the card deck, so to speak, of your natural abilities, then you might want to stretch into being an overseer. And there's so much behind that, as you guys know. I mean, for one thing, it's going to give you a list of requirements here. We're going to read those in a second. But for one thing, in today's world, it can be a bit of a risk because you're opening your home up to if you're going to do this in your home. And back in the first century, of course, they did. So you're opening your home up to anybody that's going to come in. And then you're trying to take care of them, you're trying to educate them, but at the same time, you don't want your life destroyed by somebody either. So anytime you step into being an overseer, there's a bit of a risk. And so there's a good work behind that. There's rewards for it. So as you expand your horizon, so to speak, and say, I'm going to open my home. I've got to prepare teachings every week. I'm going to minister to people on the phone. I'm going to answer questions. I'm going to do those kind of things. There's a reward for it. On the other hand, there's a balance because you want to watch what you're saying, what you're doing. Let's go to James 3:1, please. So in James 3:1, it's kind of funny, after saying that, an overseer desires a good work, then in James 3:1, it says, not many of you should become teachers, my brothers and sisters, knowing that we will receive a stricter judgment. Because if a person has the wrong idea about God and they sin, okay, there's some judgment for that. But if you go around teaching the wrong stuff to others and leading them down the wrong path, then there's a stricter judgment for that. That, by the way, is reflected a little bit in the law of Moses. Because if you go back to Leviticus, there were different sacrifices for the sin offering depending on who sinned. So if a regular guy sinned, just an ordinary Joe in the congregation, I forget all the specific sacrifices, but let's just say an ordinary Joe sins, so he can bring a lamb of the first year. And then a leader sins and he has to bring 2 lambs and a goat or something like that. And then a priest sins, he's got to bring like a full-grown bull, this kind of thing. Those aren't exact. You can go back to Leviticus and read how the escalation of the sacrifices depending on who you were. But there was an establishment, a precedent set in the law that the greater position you stepped into, the greater reward for walking it out in a godly way, and the stricter judgment upon you, which then basically should sober us up and get us to pay attention to this in a way that we should. Let's go to Romans chapter 2, please. In Romans chapter 2, this is what we don't want. Here, we'll start in verse 17. it says, but if you call yourself a Jew, so Paul's talking to the Jews, they, of course, the chosen people, they tend to elevate themselves in their own mind, that kind of thing. He says, so you call yourself a Jew, you rely on the law, you boast in God, you know his will. Verse 10, you're confident that you yourself are a guide of the blind. Verse 20, an instructor of the senseless. Verse 21, you therefore who teach another, do you not teach yourself? Verse 22, you who say not to commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? Verse 23, you who boast in the law, you dishonor God by your transgression of the law. Verse 24, for just as it is written, the name of God is defamed among the Gentiles because of you. And when I was an atheist, I kind of lived through this because for a lot of years, I didn't even consider Christianity because my friends didn't like going to church. And a lot of what I heard on the school bus, especially you get on the school bus Monday morning and, there's a big buzz about, who the pastor is sleeping with, or the pastor got drunk on Saturday night in front of a bunch of people, or, the pastor did this or that or the other thing that besmirched the reputation of God. And so when a leader, and we just know this, this is just, common knowledge, everybody knows this. If a leader in the church falls, everybody thinks worse of the church. And that's, here. So here it is right here in Romans 2. The name of God is defamed among the Gentiles, in this case, among the unbelievers, because of you. So we don't want to be in that position if we step into leadership. And that's very interesting because, first of all, there can be a lot of glory, a lot of accolades and that kind of thing for being in leadership. And you have to, I can tell you from my own experience, I have what I consider to be a fairly clear picture of the judgment in my mind and what it's going to be like when I stand before the Lord. And I will tell you, on a 50-50 balance, there's more days that I feel like I'm not going to do so well than the days that I feel like, wow, I'm really going to do well. Because I know my own capacity, I know what I can do. And then I read in Christianity Today and in these other magazines about these guys that, they pick up their whole life, they leave everything behind, they go to Timbuktu and they learn a new language and they witness to natives and then I read about the Chinese Christians and the stand that they take and the boldness that they have and this kind of thing. And I think, wow, honestly, from that kind of standpoint, my life is pretty cush. I get up in a nice house, I have a nice car, I drive to a nice office. I don't know if you can hear the air conditioning in the background, but here in Florida it's pretty hot outside, but the air conditioner is running. And I think about some of the sacrifices that Christians have made, and then how am I really pushing myself to pray, really pushing myself to speak in tongues without ceasing? Am I really pushing myself? And I think then there are the times that I think, yeah, John, you're doing great, but it's a balance, and you when you're in leadership, you need to be very good at self-awareness, and you need to listen to the people around you, because if you need to take a sabbatical for a while to get your life together, something comes up, and you need to take a sabbatical to get your life together, do it. Because what's really important is standing in front of the judge of God in the judgment seat, because the judgment there is going to last 1,000 years and maybe beyond. We don't even know. So this is important stuff. So he says, if you aspire to be an overseer, you desire a good work, but there's responsibility that comes with it. So verse 2 starts with therefore. You desire a good work, but therefore an overseer must be above reproach. And on these various words, there's commentary on the REB on all these different words. most of them are the problem we run into in when translating is when a word doesn't have an exact equivalent in English that it does in Greek or Hebrew. Or what happens is a word will mean multiple things in Greek, and only one of those things lines up in English. And then it kind of goes off on, and you don't have a perfect Venn diagram. You have more of a thing where there's a little piece of the circle that's the same. But in this case, with a word like above reproach, we kind of get what it's saying there. If you're going to be an overseer, what you want to strive for is being above reproach. Now, again, why has God given us this list? Two main reasons. One is so we can self-evaluate. When we hold this list up, it's like holding up a mirror. We can look at this list and we can see, okay, I'm doing good here. I'm not doing good there. It's like the fruit of the Spirit. When I hold up the fruit of the Spirit, it goes love. Okay, yeah, I think I'm being mostly loving in my life. Love, joy. Yeah, I'm a pretty joyful person. Peace, maybe 6 on a scale of 10. Then we get down to patience and I'm like, oops. Now I'm down to the 4.5 level, or maybe the 3 level. That's something I'm really working on right now. I'm just, there's a couple things in my life that I'm really working on my personal character. One that I'm kind of proud of, that and I've mentioned this before in my teachings, but it was a number of months ago that my wife told me I was a complainer, and I didn't think of myself as a complainer. But then as I kind of held up, okay, don't be a complainer in the mirror, and started listening to myself, I was like, man, I complain a lot. Well, and here's Philippians that says, be thankful and be joyful and all that stuff. And I realized, so I've really declared war on complaining in my life. And I will tell you, it's made a difference. I am a more peaceful, happier person now than I was 6 months ago. And I have really worked on that. And so now I'm working on not complaining and patience. So those are my 2 big attacks right now. And we've got to do that. We've got to hold this stuff up to ourselves and like a mirror and see how we're doing. So it's above reproach. And you'll read in the commentary, this was used of a wrestler in the Greco-Roman sports culture. It was used of a wrestler that it couldn't be grabbed. He couldn't be grabbed and be thrown down. And it's interesting that the list here in Timothy starts out with is for leaders, that the leader lives a life that's above reproach. We're not liars, we're not cheaters, we're not lawbreakers. It's kind of an umbrella word. It covers a whole lot of categories. And again, it's a really good mirror, because if you're not quite above reproach in some areas, it doesn't mean you have to give up leadership, but it does mean that you should become pretty serious about focusing up and saying, okay, where's this area that in my life that I need to improve? But also the flip side, see, one side of this list is we use it for self-evaluation. The other side is we compare our leaders to this list. Because I'll tell you, there's a lot of church leaders that don't measure up in this list. And you can be a good talker and you can get a big following. And that's why Christ said, you will know them by their fruit. We look at people, same thing in government. My gosh, the government leaders, if the leaders in the government of the United States actually believed in the final judgment, that they would stand before the Lord on the day of judgment and receive for what they had done in this life, probably half of them would resign, because they just don't have the character to be in the position that they're in. And so that's one of the things. So the list is given for us as a mirror. The list is given for us to know, is this leader worth following or not? So it starts out with this umbrella word, above reproach, where we're looking at areas of our life that the adversary could use to throw us down. And then it says the husband of one wife, that theoretically should be fairly easy to take a look at. You're either married to one woman or you're not. In the culture, this is a lot deeper than we think of it now, because in the culture that we live in the American culture, basically polygamy is forbidden, at least, legally it is. I mean, I know there's some practicing polygamists, but you're married to one wife. And this has been misinterpreted or misunderstood in a couple different ways. One certainly is by the church that teaches that ministers cannot be divorced. And this is simply not what the text is saying. I know you'll hear that in some denominations, but that's not what's going on here. One of the things that becomes very clear when you look at this list in the Greek is the tenses of the verbs are all the same. And they're basically referring to the present tense. So, for example, if we just say above reproach, think about that. Was every minister of the gospel above reproach their whole life? Or are they above reproach when they're an overseer? You take the Apostle Paul, he was certainly an overseer. Was he above reproach his whole life? Absolutely not. Not even close. Okay, if you can carry that through the whole list. After husband of one wife is clear-headed. There's a lot of Christian ministers who are clear-headed now, but they may have been a drug addict, a thief, a car. There's all, there's a lot of people that had a very sordid past who are now Christian ministers who are clear-headed. The point is that you look through the whole list, and the denominations are very clear about the fact that you haven't had to be above reproach since birth. You haven't had to be clear-headed since birth. You haven't had to be sensible or respectable or given to hospitality since birth or even since childhood. That those things are what you have to be right now. And yet somehow or other, then they get to husband of one wife and they're like, well, he did have another wife at one time, so he's disqualified. Okay, in that case, nobody would be able to make this list, basically. Jesus Christ could. Because so many people have pasts that can't agree with this list. So you've got the husband of one wife. Now, buried in here is the fact that the word wife here, there's the Greek word for woman is gune. So the husband of one woman. It is wife, absolutely. That's a meaning of the Hebrew word gune. By the way, the word gynecology comes from that. But the fact that it's got overtones of being a woman it's much deeper than just, I'm married to one girl. It's that you're a one woman. Men are to be a one woman man. And what does that mean to the Christian minister? You don't walk around oogling women. You don't walk around making comments about women's body or whatever, it is that men want to comment about. I've got a wife. She's the focus of my life. She's the love of my life. I'm not talking about other women. I'm not looking at other women. I'm not, it's like Job said, that my eyes, my eyes are where they ought to be, and my mouth is where it ought to be. Now let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, because I want to show you this. This, I think, is pretty important. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we have a title shift from the law. Because in the law of Moses, as you're probably well aware, a man could have more than one wife. David had a bunch. Solomon had, basically 1,000. Many of the kings had more than one wife. Many of the people had more than one wife. Jacob himself had Rachel and Leah. So verse 1, now concerning the things about which you wrote, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. In this case, the word touch is used idiomatically for to touch sexually. But again, if we're gonna peel this onion back, a lot of times the intimate relationship between a man and a woman begins with touch. And so basically, although he's using the idiom here, touch, to talk about sexual intercourse, the fact of the matter is it's a good use of the idiom because it points to the start of the illicit relationship. So I think that's one of the reasons, because, having sex was in their vocabulary. He said, it's good for a man not to have sex with a woman, meaning somebody not his wife. But the use of the idiom there adds a depth to the thinking person that the text is going deeper than just the surface. And then verse 2, but because there's so much sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife and each woman have her own husband. And this verse changed the way that sexual things were done between men and women ever since literally the fall of Adam and Eve. Because if you go back into early Genesis, Enoch, was it Enoch? No, maybe it was actually, who had more than one wife, the first guy who was a polygamist back in early Genesis. And was it Enoch, Steve? Not well, anyway, I can't hear you because you're muted, but yeah, but I think that I can't remember, but anyways, he's in Cain's line in any case. So, but here, all of a sudden, after a man can have more than one wife for 4,000 years, now God says, okay, I want each man to have his own wife and let every woman have her own husband. And interestingly enough, although in the right social context, this produced great stability, in the wrong social context, although it produced social stability, it also was extremely difficult for both the man and the woman. And one of the things, this idea that, it's easy to be a Christian. No, it's not easy to be a Christian. And the more ungodly the society, the more difficult it was to be a Christian. So, for example, it was very typical in the Roman society, if you were in the upper echelons, that you would be invited to dinner and you would go to dinner, and then prostitutes would be provided for dessert. And that was just pretty standard procedure. There weren't a whole lot of highfalutin dinner times that there weren't prostitutes and that kind of thing. So, and the Christian man would have to say, this really isn't for me. Thank you very much. And so he would get a lot of pressure from the other men. What's wrong with you? Your religion is ridiculous. That's what women are for, blah, 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 blah. There'd be a lot of pressure on men, and particularly also because if there was a female slave in the house, basically the master of the house was more or less expected to have sex with her. It was just part of the culture. It was what was expected. She was available and she couldn't say no, and that's as simple as it was. And so the Christian man, to stand on this, had to stand against the society around him. All right, well, what about the Christian women? Well, if you go back into the Roman society and study the Roman society, there was a reason that so many women were really happy that their husbands had sex with the slaves and with prostitutes, because the major cause of death in the Roman Empire among young women was childbirth. I mean, every single child a woman had was a potential death sentence to her. And so there were a whole lot of Roman women that after they'd had a child or two, they were like, you know what? There's a slave. Go be with her. I like my life. Thank you. So now all of a sudden you've got this command of God to the women that they need to be available, sexually available for their wife. That's what, as you read verse 3, let the husband fulfill his obligation to the wife, likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband, likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So now all of a sudden you've got wives that would be, particularly if they've had a difficult pregnancy and a difficult birth, they'd be like, really, husband, can't you go have sex with the slaves? my last birth was really dangerous, and I'm really concerned for my health and my life. And so once again, we see that doing things God's way, in this case, one man, one woman, makes it more challenging for the men in the society, makes it more challenging for the women in the society. And it's kind of a microcosm of the fact that when we take Christ as Lord and we are ambassadors for Christ and we have the word of reconciliation, the ministry of reconciliation, we are fellow workers with God, that there's a responsibility there. And in a fallen society, which we live in, that responsibility is not always easy. And that certainly happened to both the men and the women in the Roman society, when you've got 1 Timothy chapter 3 saying the men are to be the husband of one wife. That is going to put pressure on the men and also on the women. And that, but if we do it right and we can structure all of society, then it becomes easier for everybody. So the husband of one wife, clear-headed, basically, clear-headed is be clear-headed, be temperate, be watchful, don't get drunk, that kind of thing. By the way, when you read verses like clear-headed and alcohol is legal, then are we supposed to be clear-headed with legal stuff? I mean, you don't have to be clear-headed if alcohol is legal, right? You can get drunk, right? And the answer, of course, is no. So we're supposed to be clear-headed with things, even if they're legal. And that becomes important because, up until just recently, a lot of the drugs, the recreational drugs, were not legal. And now more and more, the recreational drugs are becoming legal. But for a Christian, the question we need to ask ourselves is not, is this legal in our society? But is this where I want to go, or is this where I want my leaders to go? And you see leaders that, they're off in Fogville a lot of the time. Well, it's probably not the best leader to follow. Same thing with sensible. Sophron, someone who uses sound reason, who thinks straightly. And we want that in ourselves, and we want that in others. Respectable, the Greek word is kosmios. By the way, it's related to the word cosmos, which is world. It's also from where we get cosmetics. It's the Greek word behind the English word cosmetics. So you guys, you understand what cosmetics are about. For you women, you feel more respectable in public or whatever. Basically, behind the word is decent, modest, well-behaved, respectable. And that's something that we want to see in ourselves and something we want to see in our leaders. The world is going completely the other way. One of the things that I'm unhappy to run into down here in Florida on the beach is this. I don't know if this is new or not, but the young girls are wearing, I don't even know what you call them, but it's not enough. It's not enough clothing to cover anything. It's just what they wear in the way of a swimsuit to the beach is just nothing. There's a lot of girls that I think, when I first walked down the beach, when Genevieve and I walk, and we walk onto the beach, and I look down 50 yards down, and, you can't resolve everything perfectly that far down. You're like, that girl's naked. And then, of course, you find out that they're not naked. They're dang near naked. Frankly, to me, that's not modest. It's not respectable. It's part of our society. It's what we have to put up with. But honestly, what we want to model as Christian ministers is that we would dress respectably, we would talk respectfully, that we would be modest, not only in our appearance, but in our apportment. We're not shovey, pushy, we've got to be first, please notice me. that kind of thing. We're not like that. We're respectable. Given to hospitality. Given to hospitality was super important in the biblical world, especially in the early church and stuff as people traveled, like, the Apostle Paul traveled, and he sent Timothy out, and other people that traveled around and saw things. I mean, Apollos did, and they would have to stay in people's homes. The hotels, if you want to call them that, in the Greco-Roman world were horrible. They were absolutely horrible. And part of the reason they were horrible is they weren't like our modern hotels where you rent a room. If you were in the Greco-Roman Empire and you rented a hotel, what you rented was a body-sized space on the floor. And so you would get a room, and there's no telling how many other people would be in that room or what they would be doing, because the Greco-Roman world was very sexual, very sensual, and you had no idea what the people who were in the room with you were going to be into. And so it was the inns and the hotels were terrible places. And so the way to protect Christian modesty, protect the Christian sensibilities, was for the various Christians in the culture to be hospitable and to open their homes to others. And then, of course, that included as well, being aware of who needed housing, who might be out of housing. Something happened, maybe their house burned down or something. There's all kinds of tragedies that happened, or somebody ran out of food. So you were hospitable, that you shared your housing, you shared your food. And that was really super important in the biblical world. And that was a mark of Christian leadership. If there was a Christian leader who couldn't be hospitable, given to hospitality, then you would wonder about the kind of the love of God in their heart, the generosity in their heart, that kind of stuff. Then the next one is interesting because it says skilled in teaching. This is the only thing on the list that's not a character trait. When you look at this list, everything on it is a character trait, except this one thing. And that is, if you are going to be an overseer, then you've got to be skilled in teaching. And that's important because part of the job of the overseer was to bring others up in the faith, which if you weren't skilled in teaching, you would have a hard time doing. So the Bible says that the leader has to be skilled in teaching. And then if we look at Titus, let's just go to Titus real quick. In chapter 1, verse 9, Timothy and Titus both have things to say about leadership, but in chapter 1, verse 9, it talks about here's your leader, and it says, holding firmly to the faithful word as he has been taught, so that he will be able both to encourage others by his sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. Because if you think about that, think about the Greco-Roman society, and now you're going to introduce them to Christianity. So somebody is invited into your home. Hey, this is a great place to go. We love fellowship. It's fun. Other Christians are nice. You probably want to come along. Then you get a visitor and you start talking about one God and one Lord. And they're like, well, wait a minute. You mean you don't worship Zeus? And the next thing you know, you're in some giant argument about worshiping Zeus. Or, you mean, wait a minute, are you saying I can't have sex with my slave girls? Am I hearing this properly? What kind of planet do you come from? So the Christian leader has to be skilled in teaching and bringing others along in the faith so they see the logic of Christianity and what's behind it. So this is the only ability in the list. Everything else is a character, which then should kind of speak loudly to us that what we are looking for in our leaders is character. Character trumps skill. Notice that It doesn't say, well, if you're skilled in teaching, we'll ignore all the rest of this. No, it's like, this is just one of the qualifications, and character is really important. And we should look for that in our leaders as well. Then not an excessive drinker, back in Timothy. And again, I think what we have to see in this that's really important is it's not saying not someone who gets drunk, because Ephesians covers that. That's true of every Christian. Every Christian, no Christian is supposed to get drunk, So then what's it talking about not an excessive drinker? Well, there's a point at which alcohol affects people to where they're not drunk really, but they're just not quite themselves. Their judgment kind of goes out the window, or they can't hold on to proper thinking, or whatever it is. And each person's going to be different, and each person has to be aware of where that spot is in their own life. But this is more than just don't get drunk. This is, your job is to be sensible, clear-headed, respectable. And if you're going to do that, you've got to know where that boundary is, where all of a sudden things start slipping. Your vocabulary starts slipping, your inhibition starts slipping, that kind of stuff. You're not drunk yet, but there's a line there, and everybody knows it for themselves. And so that's what this is talking about. And we look for that in our leaders. And then not violent. And of course, not violent just means that. And part of not being violent as a leader is allowing people to have their own beliefs. Okay, you're running a fellowship in the Greco-Roman Empire, and in comes a guy who says, well, I like a lot about what your God says, but, frankly, I really like what Mars allows me over here, and what Minerva allows me over here, and what Zeus allows me to do over here, and I kind of like those things. And, the Christian leader doesn't blow his stack and say, get out of my house or whatever. We realize that God gave everybody free will. God gave everybody the freedom to make choices. We love people. We may have to set boundaries, but I've just seen Christian leaders, screaming at other Christians, pushing other Christians, that kind of thing, and that's completely out of bounds. That's not the way we do. Verse 3 goes on, not violent, but reasonable. That's reasonable is such a great word here. And I will confess that in the list, this is one of the harder boundaries to hit, because we want people to obey God, but at the same time, we have to realize that sometimes the exact law can be pushed to immoral limits. That's hard to exactly put your finger on, but maybe an example of reasonableness would be what you expect in obedience from your 5-year-old versus your 9-year-old versus your 12-year-old, and that kind of thing. And understanding that, of course, obviously, God and we want perfect obedience, but you're just not going to get it. And the reasonable person understands the boundaries and parameters and how they shift. And different people, for example, my daughter Carly birthday party was we had her birthday party on Sunday afternoon, and her son Colton, our grandson, had some of his friends over, and a couple of them, because of the school he goes to, a couple of them are learning disability, ADD, and various places on the autistic spectrum, and they were wild. Just absolutely wild. We had so much fun with them, but frankly, they're you just have to understand the limits of what the way an autistic child perceives life, and there's no hard and fast rule that says, okay, well, if you're a neurotypical person, then you're obedient to this degree. And if you have ADD, you're obedient to this degree. And there, we as leaders, we've got to be sensible. We've got to be reasonable in the circumstances. And the same thing is true with what we expect of our leaders, that they would be reasonable. Now, that kind of opens the door. See, if you have a law like don't steal and you're either stealing or not stealing, then it's easy to make a judgment call. But when you have behavioral situations and you've got to make judgment calls, it's very possible that you would have two people disagree. This happens a lot in blended families. Genevieve and I just recently took a marriage seminar, and one of the sessions was on blended families. And, you had the wife, and she said, well, I always discipline my kid this way. It was the husband and wife being, they were on the couch talking in this one segment. And the wife was like, and I discipline my kids this way, but he would discipline the kids this way. And, they both have ideas, and they're both good Christian people. It was a Christian seminar. But they're going to differ on exactly what that's going to look like in any given situation due to parameters. And so here's the scripture. And when it says that you want to be reasonable, oftentimes you've got to work out the boundaries of exactly what reasonable is. But it's a very important word, and it's good that it's in this list, because then it opens the door for some latitude where you can be human with people. That becomes important. Not quarrelsome, obviously, very important for leaders. We don't quarrel. Very few, you almost never win an argument in a quarrel. Anyway, people are going to believe what they're going to believe. So you talk things out, and if you differ, you differ. The leader isn't quarrelsome. We try not to be quarrelsome either. Not a lover of money. And you guys know what a lover of money is. And where this really comes up in ministry, it's kind of interesting, because I just along with that birthday party, I had a man over to my house, one of the fathers of the kids, and he was talking about the fact, because he I'm a biblical historian, that's the way I present myself. He said, yeah, the church. And he said, one of the things I don't understand about the church, he said, my wife and I were going to church for a while, and he said, almost everybody in the church had no money, and the minister lived in this gigantic house with these really nice cars, and he had a real problem with that. Well, maybe the guy inherited $1 million. I don't know exactly how it happened, so I wasn't going to speak on it. But I do know from my mission trips to Haiti and the Philippines and South Africa that there's a lot of times where ministers browbeat the members in the congregation, like, you'll get more rewards, and you'll get this, and you'll get that, and you've got to give money to the church because it's a command of God. And then they live high off the hog, and the people don't, and it's easy for an unscrupulous minister to teach in such a way that it really pressures the people to give money to the church that they don't need to give, that they really ought to have for their to apply to themselves or their family or extended family. I'll give you an example. I was invited to teach at a church in the Philippines one time, and whenever we go to a church where I've never been before, I tell the minister, please go to our statement of beliefs, check out what we believe, make sure that you're going to be comfortable with what we're going to be teaching. And the minister said, yeah, I'm comfortable with it. So I taught on the permanence of Christian salvation. Well, what I didn't know was that he was teaching in his church that if you didn't tithe, you would lose your salvation. And we're in the Philippines, and so there's just bazoodles of poor people that barely can put food on their table, and they're giving all this money to the church. Well, the week after I taught there were 10 or 12 families that left this church. And they left this church because they realized that they didn't have to be in his church, and they didn't have to give 10% to be saved. So they went to find another church where they felt a little more at home. Now, would I have taught that had I known the way he was behaving? No, I'm not going to blow somebody's church up. That's not what I do in life. But in the honesty of my heart, I asked him if he knew what we taught. He said yes. And he certainly didn't tell me. And by the way, the reason I have this nice church and this nice house here in the Philippines and these great cars is because I demand that people tithe to this church or they're going to lose their salvation. And probably, frankly, had I known that, I would have declined the invitation to even teach there. I just would have said, we're probably on the different page here. But as it was, this was the effect. Once people were released from that bondage, that they realized, I'm going to be saved without having to come to this church and tithe. They didn't go to they left that church. So when it talks about that and says, not a lover of money, we don't beat people up for finances. And then verse 4, one who's leading his own household well, having his children in subjection with all dignity. Couple things we need to be aware of, if we're going to use this as a mirror, is that in the biblical world, girls were usually married at 12 to 15. Guys were usually married at 14 to 16 to 17. So we're not talking about having an 18-year-old at home in your house. And biblically, that's not a child. That guy is married and gone. We're not having, a 15-year-old rebellious girl in the house. We're talking about that girl would be married and she'd be off on her own with her husband and he could deal with her or whatever. But if you've got small children, 5, 8, 9, that age group, and they're running the house, then there's something wrong with the way you're perceiving life. And that's very much what this is saying. And I will say that I think due to the internet and TV and schools away from home where kids spend much more time with their fellow students than they do with the parents, this is challenging. Verse 4 is challenging, leading your own household well. But it still can be done, and it's something that we need to strive for and then look to our leaders about. In verse 6, not a new believer, so that he doesn't become conceited and fall into the condemnation of the devil. And then verse 7, he must have a good reputation among those who are outside the church. And that's a huge key with church leadership. Do the non-Christians feel good about this person? And these are things that's important for us to kind of have in our head. Like I say, they're a great mirror. When we're trying to be more Christ-like, we're trying to figure out, are we in the ballpark of what God wants? And then they're a great mirror for us to look, or maybe a microscope or something, to look at our leaders and say, how are they doing? What's going on? So that's what I wanted to cover tonight. And I know I've got a lot of this stuff in commentary, but I've just seen so much bizarre behavior in our government leaders here of late. And I will confess that when I read last week, because today's only Tuesday, when I read last week in the Christian news that the Church of England had publicly come out and said that at this point in time, it cannot define a woman, I was just like, this is crazy. We got church leaders that are going crazy. We have government leaders that are going crazy. And we can use that to speak to people about the difference between right and wrong, good and evil, God and the devil, and see if we can turn some people from darkness to light, get them serious about thinking about where are you going to be when you die, because you are going to die. So where are you going to be at that time? So thank you for being with me tonight. I hope this has been informative. It was a blessing to do the work behind it, and love you guys a lot. We'll open the floor.